The sky was burning. The first explosion shattered the calm of dawn, sending shockwaves through the air and rattling windows all across New York. People screamed in the streets as massive alien ships emerged from the sky like predatory vultures, their sleek black hulls casting shadows that swallowed entire blocks. The Zorath were here. Jake Thorne stood at the edge of his apartment, staring out across the city. His fingers tightened around the worn rim of his coffee mug, but he didn't feel the warmth. The coffee had gone cold hours ago. The world was ending, but to Jake, it felt like just another day, a reminder of how little control he had over his own life. He hadn't planned on being part of this war. He'd left that life behind long ago, after the last mission went south. After the bloodshed, the pain, and the guilt of losing his comrades, he retreated. From the military, from humanity's hopes, from everyone. He wasn't a hero, he was just a man who had failed. But now, as the alien fleet hovered ominously above Earth, Jake knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. He knew he couldn't ignore the desperate calls for help echoing from every corner of the globe. They were coming, and they were coming fast. Humanity had only one chance, and it was buried in the hands of the reluctant. A knock at the door snapped him from his thoughts. Jake turned, annoyance flashing across his face. Who would be looking for him at a time like this? He hadn't been expecting anyone. But before he could even cross the room, the door swung open. It was Captain Alara, her face drawn, eyes burning with a mixture of urgency and determination. "You know what's happening, right?" she asked, her voice low but forceful. Jake just nodded. He didn't have the energy to speak. Alara took a step into the room, her uniform rumpled, but she wore the weight of a commander with pride. She had been the one to train him, pushing him to his limits, trying to get him to be the soldier he could never be. He had failed her then, failed everyone, and now she was here to drag him back into the hell that was descending upon Earth. "I need you, Jake," Alara continued, her voice softer now but still laced with desperation. "The Resistance needs you. Earth needs you." He met her eyes, but the familiar weight of self-doubt clung to him like a second skin. He had nothing left to give. After all that had happened, after the death of his comrades and the shattered mission, how could anyone trust him again? How could he trust himself? "I'm done with that life, Alara," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't have anything to offer. I'm not the man you think I am. I can't do it." She was silent for a moment, her gaze never leaving his. Her face softened, and she stepped closer, laying a hand on his shoulder. "I know what happened, Jake, but this isn't about the past. This is about the future. Your future. You can't hide from this. You're the only one who can lead Earth's last chance." Her words echoed in his mind, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that gripped him. The Zorath were coming, their weapons capable of leveling entire cities with ease, their forces ruthless and merciless. Jake had seen it all in the training simulations, but this was different. This was real. Jake exhaled slowly, staring out the window once more at the ships above the skyline, growing larger with every passing minute. He could already hear the distant sounds of sirens, of chaos, of panic. His fingers twitched at his sides, instinctively reaching for the rifle that wasn't there. His body was ready for action, but his mind, it was still lost in the past. "Jake," Alara's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts, sharp and insistent. "Don't do this. Don't run." He turned back to face her, his eyes heavy with regret. "I don't know how to leave anymore." She gave him a small, determined smile. "Then let us teach you. The world's not going to wait for you to figure it out." Jake stared at her, his heart heavy with doubt, but for the first time in years, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in so long, stirred within him. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to make things right. As the alien fleet descended toward Earth, Jake made his decision. It was time to fight again. But this time, he would fight not just for his survival, but for humanity's. The air in the Resistance base was thick with tension as Jake Thorne stood in the command room, surrounded by faces he didn't recognize. Young, eager soldiers who hadn't experienced the true horrors of war. And then there was Alara, the steady anchor, her presence like a calm in the storm. But even she couldn't hide the weight of the task ahead. The entire planet was looking to them, hoping they could hold the line against the Zorath. Jake stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, his posture stiff. His mind wasn't in the briefing. It was on the past, the missions he'd failed, the friends he'd lost, the promises he'd broken. He could feel the ghosts of his fallen comrades in every corner of the room, haunting him, reminding him of why he left it all behind. Alara, ever perceptive, caught his distant gaze. She approached him, her voice quiet but firm. "We need you, Jake. The Resistance needs you to lead." Jake barely looked at her. He hadn't even unpacked his gear yet, and already the pressure was mounting. This wasn't what he had signed up for. He had left all of this behind after the disastrous mission in Vexor 9. When he had been in command of a squad that was sent to neutralize a Zorath foothold, and it had ended in disaster. His men had died and he had failed them. He'd watched their bodies fall, one by one, and had done nothing to stop it. He was supposed to be their leader. Instead, he had led them to their graves. "I'm not who you think I am, Alara," Jake muttered, turning away from her to look out the base's perimeter window, where the distant glow of burning cities illuminated the night sky. "I don't belong here." Alara was silent for a moment, studying him. "You think I don't know that?" Her voice was low, but the edge in it was unmistakable. "I've seen you doubt yourself before, Jake. Hell, I've doubted you too, but you're the only one who can turn this around. There's no one else." Jake clenched his fists. The words stung. The guilt gnawed at him, sharper now than ever. He could feel it deep in his chest, that familiar pang of failure. He'd let her down. He'd let everyone down. The door to the command room opened, and the moment passed. A young officer stepped inside, breathless. "Sir, we've got a problem." The officer handed over a data pad, eyes wide with fear. "The Zorath have launched a major assault on the eastern continent. They're moving faster than we anticipated. The main resistance forces are on the brink of being overwhelmed." Jake took the pad, scanning the information. The Zorath were relentless, their forces sweeping across the globe with terrifying precision. Every stronghold, every last bastion of defense, was crumbling under their assault. "We can't keep up," Jake muttered, his voice cracking under the weight of the situation. His mind raced, calculating the odds, the movements of the enemy, the tactics they could use. It was all coming too fast. Alara placed a hand on his shoulder. "We can't afford to hesitate, Jake. We need to hit them where it hurts, or we'll lose Earth in the next 24 hours. Jake nodded, but the fear in his gut tightened. He was being thrust into the role of a leader again, whether he was ready or not. He couldn't let the ghosts of the past control him any longer. The people around him needed him. Alara needed him. Earth needed him. He turned to face her, his expression hardened. "Get the team ready. I'll lead the assault." Alara raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden shift in his tone. "Are you sure?" Jake met her eyes, his jaw set with resolve. "We don't have time for doubts. Let's finish this." The room was silent as Alara nodded. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt something stirring inside him. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something else, something stronger. A fire buried deep inside that had been dormant for far too long. He was going to fight, not because he had to, but because he could. He would do this for them, for his fallen comrades, and for humanity. Alara turned to the rest of the room, giving the orders to mobilize. As the team filed out to prepare for the assault, Jake stood at the center of the command room, staring at the map on the screen. The Zorath were closing in. The clock was ticking. And for the first time, Jake Thorne didn't run from his fear. He embraced it. Jake stood in the heart of the battlefield, the bitter scent of burnt earth hanging heavy in the air. The Resistance had launched its counteroffensive against the Zorath in the early hours of the morning. It wasn't a full-scale assault yet, that would come later. This was a hit-and-run operation, a small group of soldiers infiltrating the Zorath's outer defenses to disable their communication network and slow their advance. The odds were stacked against them, but it was their only chance to buy Earth some time. Jake crouched low behind a burnt-out vehicle, his pulse pounding in his ears. His team moved in the shadows around him, a small, highly trained unit that had learned to adapt to the chaos of war. He trained them, but now, as their leader, he could see the fear in their eyes. They were brave, yes, but none of them had seen combat like this. Not like him. Alora's voice crackled through his earpiece, calm and authoritative as always. Jake, you're up. The comms tower is 2 clicks ahead. You've got 5 minutes before the Zorath reinforcements arrive. Jake nodded to himself, already calculating the next steps. They had to move fast. There was no room for mistakes. He signaled to his squad to move out, keeping low, slipping between the wreckage of what had once been a bustling city. Every step felt like an eternity, and the silence of the ruined streets only amplified the dread that hung over them all. But just as they reached the edge of the Zorath's perimeter, Jake froze. A rustling sound came from the shadows. Someone was moving in their direction. His hand instinctively went to his weapon, but before he could act, a voice whispered sharply from behind him, "Don't shoot." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He spun around, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. A young woman in military fatigues, covered in dirt and blood, stood there, her rifle slung over her shoulder. She was no soldier he recognized. "I'm not here to fight you," she continued, her voice tense. "I've got info you need." Jake hesitated, weighing his options. He could order her to surrender, but in this world, trust was a luxury they didn't have. Yet there was something about her, something familiar. Her eyes weren't those of a soldier. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much. Her voice wasn't demanding, it was pleading. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his tone sharp. "Name's Lyra," the woman said, taking a cautious step forward. "I was with a small unit sent to gather intel on the Zorath forces. They're stronger than we thought. If you don't move now, you'll be walking straight into an ambush." Jake exchanged a look with Alara, who was still monitoring the situation from the command center. There was no way to confirm this woman's story, but they didn't have the luxury of time. "Lead the way," Jake said, his voice firm, "but make no mistake, we're watching you." Lyra nodded, showing no fear, and turned toward the Zorath encampment. As they moved, Jake's mind raced. Who was she really? And how did she know so much about the Zorath's plans? Could she be trusted? The group continued forward, moving through the debris of the war-torn city, until Lyra led them into an abandoned building that had once served as a civilian shelter. She motioned for them to stay low and quiet as she approached a terminal in the corner of the room, its flickering screen barely visible in the dim light. "Here," she whispered, tapping away at the keys. "I've been tracking their communications. They've got a major operation planned for tomorrow. They're hitting multiple cities at once." Jake leaned in, studying the information on the screen. The Zorath were planning a full-scale assault on the capital, more troops, more firepower, and a new weapon that could change the tide of the war. If they didn't act fast, Earth's last hope would be obliterated. "Thanks," Jake muttered, his mind already calculating the next move. The Resistance had one shot at this. They had to strike now, or it would be too late. Lyra stepped back, her eyes weary but determined. "There's more. I've got access to their mainframe. We can do more than just slow them down. We can hit them where it hurts." Jake looked at her, suspicion still lingering, but this was too important to question. For the first time, he felt the spark of hope flicker in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, this was the break they needed. He turned to his squad. "We've got a target," he said. "Let's move." As the team rallied around him, ready to follow his command, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer alone in this fight. Whether he was ready or not, the resistance had found its spark, and it was time to light the fire. Jake's team moved with precision through the streets, their boots pounding the cracked concrete beneath them. The information Lyra had provided was critical, but now they had to act on it, fast. Every moment they spent in the open was another moment the Zorath could strike. The capital was just beyond the city's shattered outskirts, and if they didn't disrupt the Zorath's planned assault, Earth would fall within hours. Jake's pulse quickened as they approached the Zorath's makeshift command center. It was nestled in the ruins of what had once been a civilian apartment complex, its walls reinforced with alien technology. Guards were posted at every entry, and the place buzzed with activity. This wasn't just a military installation, it was a strategic hub. They couldn't afford to underestimate the Zorath. If they failed here, Earth's last line of defense would be crippled before it even had a chance to respond. Allura's voice came through Jake's earpiece, steady and calm despite the chaos unfolding around them. "Jake, we're tracking their movements. The main Zorath fleet is still positioned over the eastern continent, but they're mobilizing their forces for the strike on the capital. You have 10 minutes before the reinforcements arrive. Get in, disable the command center, and get out. We won't have a second chance." Jake exhaled sharply, nodding to his squad. They had no choice but to move now. He glanced at Lyra, who had insisted on accompanying them despite the risks. Her presence was a wild card, but right now they needed all the help they could get. They approached the perimeter in silence, using the rubble as cover. Jake's eyes flicked to the rooftops above them, his senses on high alert. He was used to this kind of tension, but the stakes had never been this high. Not in his career, not in any of the countless missions he'd been on. The survival of humanity rested on their shoulders, and there was no room for mistakes. "On my mark," Jake whispered, signaling to the team. His hand hovered over his weapon as he began to step forward. His heart was racing, but his mind was focused. They couldn't let fear take hold. Not now. The first guard appeared, moving lazily across the entryway. It was the perfect opportunity. Jake signaled, and in a fluid motion, his squad surged forward, quick and silent. 2 guards fell without a sound, their bodies crumpling to the ground. Lyra's eyes were sharp, her movements quick as she disabled the alarm system at the door. Jake pressed his hand against the door, feeling the hum of the Zorath's alien technology behind it. The door opened with a faint whir, and they slipped inside, the heavy steel sliding shut behind them. The dimly lit hallway smelled of dust and burnt circuits, the air thick with the scent of alien metal and human sweat. As they moved deeper into the heart of the command center, Jake's mind raced through the mission parameters. They had to reach the central control room, where the Zorath's main communication network was being operated. That was their key to crippling the invasion. But there were still obstacles to overcome: Zorath soldiers, automated turrets, and the overwhelming sense that time was slipping away. They reached the first checkpoint, a reinforced hallway guarded by 2 Zorath soldiers standing watch at the far end. Jake held up a fist, signaling the team to stop. He peered around the corner, taking in the guards' positions. He knew they didn't have much time. The rest of the squad crouched low, weapons ready. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes glinting with resolve. "I can take them out quietly," she whispered, glancing at Jake. "You don't need to risk exposure." Jake considered it for a moment. He wasn't used to trusting strangers, especially not someone who had just walked into their lives. But there was no time to waste on doubts, he nodded. "Do it," he said, his voice low but commanding. Lyra moved swiftly, like a shadow. Within seconds, she was behind the 2 guards. The sound of a swift chokehold was the only indication they had even been there. Her swift, efficient method didn't even raise a whisper. She signaled them to move forward. Jake breathed a silent sigh of relief. The team continued, their movements growing more precise with each step. The hallways twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the heart of the Zorath stronghold. The tension was thick, but Jake kept his focus. This mission wasn't just about military tactics. It was about the survival of Earth. Every decision they made could be the difference between victory and extinction. Finally, they reached the central control room. Jake motioned for the squad to spread out, covering all angles. Lyra moved to the terminal and began hacking into the Zorath system, her fingers flying over the keys with practiced ease. Jake stood watch, every nerve on edge, waiting for the inevitable sound of Zorath reinforcements. "Just a few more seconds," Lyra said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. Jake's gaze snapped to the door, hearing footsteps growing closer. "We don't have much time," he said, tension rising in his chest. "Hurry up." The door behind them creaked. The reinforcements were almost there. And then, with a soft beep, the screen in front of them blinked green. "I've got it," Lyra said, looking up with a determined smile. "The Zorath's communication grid is offline." The countdown had begun. Jake's heart raced as the screen in front of him flashed green. The mission was far from over, but disabling the Zorath's communication grid was a critical victory. It was their opening, their chance to hit back. The enemy's coordination would falter, and the resistance might finally have a fighting chance. But there was no time for celebration. Jake turned to his squad, eyes steely with focus. "Move out. We've disrupted their comms, but we're not done yet. We need to leave now before they realize what's happened." Lyra, who had been kneeling at the terminal, stood up and nodded without a word. Her face was streaked with dirt, but there was a fire in her eyes that wasn't there before. Jake wasn't sure how much he trusted her yet, but for the moment, she was their ally. He motioned for her to lead the way. The team moved quickly through the corridors of the Zorath base, retracing their steps with precision. The wall seemed to close in on them as the sound of Zorath reinforcements grew louder. Jake's ears rang with the footsteps, and his grip tightened on his weapon. The adrenaline was a double-edged sword. Every second felt like an eternity. "Jake," Alara's voice crackled in his ear, "we've got movement on the ground. The Zorath are responding to the comms disruption. They're sending a full battalion toward your location." Jake's jaw clenched. He had known the moment would come. The Zorath were no fools. They'd already sent reinforcements in their direction. But it wasn't just the Zorath's military presence that worried him, it was the unknown. They were dealing with an enemy unlike any they had faced before, and Jake couldn't help but wonder if they had more tricks up their sleeves. "We're almost out," Jake said, keeping his voice calm despite the storm brewing around them. "Stay with us." His squad rounded a corner just as the sound of alien footsteps echoed through the hallway. There was no way to avoid them. The Zorath had finally figured it out. They knew they were under attack. Jake's mind raced through his options, but there was only one way out. He glanced over at Lyra. "Set the charges," he ordered. Lyra's eyes flashed with understanding. "On it." She hurried toward a control panel on the far wall, her movements fluid and deliberate. Jake and the rest of the squad took cover behind the nearest barricades. The tension in the air was suffocating as they waited for Lyra to finish planting the explosives. A series of beeps sounded as Lyra worked her way through the security systems. She didn't flinch, didn't break her concentration. The Zorath soldiers were closing in. They could hear the hissing of their alien weapons, the clinking of their boots on the cold metal floors. Jake felt a rush of cold dread, but he forced it down. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone. "Charges set," Lyra said, her voice sharp. "Get ready to move." Jake nodded and motioned for the squad to prepare. They were going to make their exit the only way they could, through sheer force. The explosives would be their final signal to the Zorath. Earth would not fall without a fight. "Now," Jake said, his voice hard as steel. Lyra activated the detonator, and the explosion rocked the building. The blast reverberated through the walls, a deafening boom that sent shockwaves down the corridors. The Zorath were caught off guard, scrambling to adjust their strategy. Jake didn't waste a second. He signaled for his team to move, and they surged forward, sprinting toward the exit. The world around them was chaos, flashes of light, smoke, and the shrill wail of alarms blaring in every direction. The Zorath were in disarray, momentarily stunned by the attack. They reached the outer courtyard of the base, their path finally clear. The sky above them was filled with the sound of distant explosions as the resistance forces engaged the enemy on multiple fronts. Jake looked up for a moment, the weight of the battle still pressing down on his chest. "Alara," he breathed into his comms, "we're out. What's our next move?" "Regroup with the others. We'll take the fight to them now," Alara replied. "The Zorath are still strong, but their communications are in chaos. You've given us a fighting chance. We'll push forward." Jake's heart clenched with relief. They weren't done yet. They had made a real impact, and the tide of the war could finally start to shift in their favor. But he knew this was just one battle. The war would rage on. "Good, let's make it count." The squad moved toward the extraction point, the sounds of war echoing around them. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that their victory, while hard-earned, was only the beginning. There was still so much more to do. But as he looked over his team, each of them showing signs of wear, but also a renewed determination, he realized one undeniable truth. They had just taken the first step toward reclaiming their world. And no matter what came next, Jake Thorne wasn't going to back down. Jake's breath came in shallow bursts as he and his team made their way toward the extraction point. The air was thick with smoke, the remnants of the explosion still lingering in the streets like a heavy fog. Their mission had been a success, at least for now. The Zorath were disoriented, their communications shattered, and the resistance had gained a brief window of opportunity. But Jake knew better than to believe the battle was over. The Zorath would regroup. They always did. As they approached the rally point, a patch of broken earth that had once been a busy intersection, Jake could see the rest of the resistance fighters preparing for the next phase. A few familiar faces stood among them, weary but resolute. Alara was there, waiting for them, her expression unreadable but her stance firm. "You made it," she said, her voice carrying a hint of relief. She glanced at Lyra, then back to Jake. "I trust it went well?" Jake nodded. "We've hit them hard. Their communication grid is down, and we disrupted their supply lines. But they're already responding. We won't have long before they figure out what happened." Alara's eyes narrowed as she processed the information. "That gives us precious little time to strike." "That's the plan," Jake replied, voice steady. "We've got a window of opportunity to make them pay, but we need to act fast." A voice from behind them interrupted. "If you're talking about pushing the attack, I suggest you rethink it." It was Sergeant Calden, the leader of another resistance unit. His voice was gruff, but his words carried weight. Jake turned to face him. "What's the issue?" Calden's eyes scanned the horizon, where the first signs of Zorath reinforcements were starting to appear. Their ships, black as night and shaped like monstrous insects, loomed on the edge of the sky. The Zorath were regrouping faster than expected. "We've got the numbers," Calden said, "but not enough firepower. They'll wipe us out before we get close enough." Jake's heart sank, but he kept his expression neutral. They had the element of surprise on their side, but it wouldn't matter if they didn't have a way to strike back. The Zorath's advanced weapons were a brutal match for Earth's best technology, and they had yet to fully test the limits of the Zorath's strength. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes sharp. "There's another way." Everyone turned to look at her. She was an outsider, yet she'd managed to survive in the heart of the Zorath's ranks, collecting intelligence that could change the tide of the war. There was a moment of silence as everyone processed her words. "I know where they're hiding their weapon caches," Lyra continued. "The Zorath have an experimental weapon, something they've been developing for months. It's capable of turning the tide in their favor, but it's still in the prototype phase. If we destroy it, we'll cripple their military might." Jake's mind raced. This was the kind of mission they needed. Disrupting their weapons could weaken the Zorath and buy Earth even more time to prepare for the next wave of attacks. "How do you know about this weapon?" Jake asked, his voice guarded. "I infiltrated their ranks," Lyra replied, a hint of regret in her tone. "I was part of a group tasked with gathering intel on their weaponry. I've seen the blueprints. I know where they're keeping it." Calden crossed his arms. "And you think we can just walk in and destroy it? Their defenses are tight. We've barely made it out of one skirmish alive. The Zorath won't give us another chance." Lyra didn't flinch. "We don't have another choice." Jake's eyes met Lyra's, searching for any hint of hesitation. She didn't waver. There was something about her, something Jake couldn't quite place, that made him trust her. This was a gamble, but it was a chance to hit the Zorath where it hurt. He turned to Alara. "We move out immediately. The faster we hit them, the better. We take out their weapon, and we send a message they'll never forget." Alara nodded, her face hardening with resolve. "Agreed, let's get to work." As Jake surveyed the rally point, a renewed sense of determination settled over him. This was their chance. With the Zorath in disarray and their weapon vulnerable, Earth's resistance had one opportunity to strike a blow that could change the war. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth fighting forever was. The team geared up, loading their weapons and preparing for what lay ahead. They didn't have much time before the Zorath's full force would descend upon them, but Jake was ready. They had the element of surprise on their side, and that was all they needed. As they made their way toward the enemy's stronghold, the distant rumble of approaching Zorath ships grew louder, and Jake knew that the storm was about to break. This was their moment to make history. And whatever happened, Jake Thorne would fight until his last breath. The path ahead was treacherous. As Jake and his team moved through the abandoned streets, the once bustling city now stood as a silent testament to the war's devastating toll. Buildings were reduced to rubble, and the air was thick with the stench of burning debris. The Zorath's relentless assault had left nothing untouched, and now, as they made their way toward the heart of the enemy stronghold, it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Lara led the way, her movements calculated and swift, guiding them through the ruined cityscape. She had been in this area before, knew its layout, and had a plan. Her knowledge was invaluable, but Jake couldn't help but feel a nagging sense of unease. The mission was too important. If they failed, the Zorath would complete their conquest of Earth without so much as a second thought. Ahead, the massive Zorath compound loomed, an imposing fortress of jagged metal and glowing alien technology. It was heavily guarded, and the closer they got, the more Jake could feel the oppressive weight of the enemy's presence. It was like walking into the mouth of a beast, one that could snap shut at any moment. "We'll need to move fast," Lyra whispered, her eyes scanning the surroundings. "Once we're inside, we have no more than 10 minutes to find the weapon and destroy it. If we're not out by then, the Zorath will lock down the entire facility." Jake nodded. Time was their enemy, but they didn't have a choice. He signaled to his squad to stay low and move quickly. The Zorath had set up sentries along the perimeter, and they couldn't afford to be spotted. Every guard was a potential threat, and every step brought them closer to a showdown they weren't sure they could win. "Stay quiet, stay sharp," Jake muttered, his voice barely audible. The tension was palpable, but there was no turning back now. They had a job to do, and the fate of Earth rested on their shoulders. They slipped through the shadows, using every bit of cover available as they approached the entrance. Lyra took the lead again, crouching beside a large metal door embedded into the side of the compound. She ran her fingers over the surface, searching for a way in. A few quick movements, and she pulled out a small device, attaching it to the door's security panel. Jake held his breath, watching the seconds tick by. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway behind them, making his pulse spike. He wasn't sure how much time they had left. "I've got it," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a dark corridor beyond. Without a word, Jake and his team filed inside, their weapons raised, alert to every sound. The interior of the Zorath compound was even more oppressive than the outside, dimly lit by flickering alien lights. The walls lined with strange, pulsating machinery that hummed with power. "Head for the core," Lyra instructed. "It's deeper inside. The weapon should be in a reinforced chamber. I'll lead you straight to it." They moved through the halls, their footsteps muffled against the metallic floor. The further they went, the more Jake could feel the weight of the mission pressing on him. The Zorath were everywhere. Their presence seemed to seep into the very walls, an ever-present reminder that they weren't just fighting an enemy, they were fighting a force of nature. The Zorath were ruthless, efficient, and far beyond anything humanity had encountered before. "Stop," Lyra suddenly whispered, holding up a hand. The team froze in place. Jake's eyes scanned the area ahead. A group of Zorath soldiers stood between them and the chamber they needed to reach, their alien weapons gleaming in the low light. It was a perfect ambush, a trap laid for any would-be intruders. Jake's grip tightened on his rifle. "Options?" Lyra's eyes flickered toward the shadows ahead. "We can't fight them head-on, but if we disable their security drones, we might be able to slip past undetected." "Do it," Jake ordered, his voice cold and steady. He trusted her, and right now, they didn't have the luxury of time to second-guess anything. Lyra moved quickly, crouching low as she accessed the security panel hidden in the wall. Her fingers flew over the interface, and within seconds, the buzzing of drones overhead ceased. The soldiers ahead of them tensed, clearly aware that something was wrong, but they didn't know where the threat was coming from. They looked around, distracted and disoriented. Jake's squad moved like shadows, silent and swift. They took out the nearest guards with lethal precision, using hand-to-hand tactics to keep the noise to a minimum. Within moments, the path ahead was clear. "We're almost there," Lyra whispered, her voice tight with urgency. Jake nodded. The heart of the Zorath stronghold was just beyond this final stretch. The weapon they had come to destroy was within reach, but so was danger. Every step they took brought them closer to the inevitable confrontation with the Zorath. The air felt charged with tension as they approached the final doors. Behind them, the faint sounds of reinforcements stirred. Time was running out, and Jake could feel the weight of the coming storm. "Move fast, but don't get sloppy," Jake muttered, his voice low. The moment of truth was near. Everything hinged on the next few minutes, and no matter what, they would finish this. The doors to the Zorath weapon chamber slid open with a hiss, revealing the heart of their power. The room was vast, bathed in a cold, eerie blue light. Strange alien machinery hummed and pulsed, its metallic surface slick with condensation. At the center of the room stood the weapon, a massive, ominous structure that seemed to hum with energy. Jake's instincts screamed that this was the moment of reckoning. This was where it all came down to one last, desperate push. Lyra was the first to step forward, her eyes trained on the weapon. "That's it," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the low hum of the machinery. "The Zorath's prototype. If it's activated, we won't stand a chance." Jake nodded, his pulse quickening. He could feel the weight of the mission settle over him like an unshakable burden. They had come so far, endured so much, and now it all hinged on this one final act. The fate of Earth was in their hands. "Let's get to work," he said, voice steady despite the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. The squad moved quickly, spreading out as they approached the central platform that housed the weapon. Alara and Calden kept watch, weapons raised, while Jake and Lyra focused on the task at hand. Lyra moved to a console near the base of the weapon, her fingers flying over the controls as she worked to disable the system. Seconds stretched into eternity as Jake surveyed the room. His mind raced, every moment that passed felt like it could be their last. The Zorath were sure to realize something was wrong soon. They had no more time to waste. Suddenly, a sharp hiss broke the silence, followed by the distinct whir of enemy soldiers approaching. Jake's heart skipped a beat. They had found them. The Zorath were closing in fast. "They're here," Alara warned, her voice tight. "We've got company." A series of explosions rocked the walls of the chamber, sending a shockwave through the floor. The Zorath were coming in full force, heavily armed, relentless, and angry. Jake's mind snapped into focus. "Lara, are we close?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm in," she said, her voice strained. "I've disabled the system, but we need to plant the charges. It's the only way to ensure it's destroyed completely." Jake nodded. "Do it. We'll hold them off." The first wave of Zorath soldiers burst into the room, their alien weapons blazing. The squad immediately took cover behind the equipment, returning fire with precision. Jake's heart raced as he fired at the advancing enemies. Each shot felt like it could be his last, but he couldn't afford to stop. Lara worked quickly, planting charges along the base of the weapon, her hands steady despite the chaos unfolding around her. Every few seconds, she glanced up, her eyes meeting Jake's, silently conveying the urgency of the moment. They had no room for error. The Zorath soldiers advanced, their numbers growing with each passing second. The air was thick with gunfire and the acrid scent of burning metal. Jake's squad was doing their best to hold the line, but they were outnumbered, and the Zorath had the advantage of superior firepower. "Jake," Alara shouted, her voice strained. "We need to fall back. We can't hold them much longer." "Not yet," Jake yelled back, determination burning in his chest. They were so close. Lyra's work was nearly done. They couldn't give up now. With a final push, Lara finished planting the last charge. She looked up at Jake, her expression hard. "It's done. Now we get out." Jake didn't hesitate. "Fall back," he ordered, motioning for the team to retreat. They moved as one, fighting their way toward the exit as the Zorath closed in. The air was filled with the deafening sounds of blaster fire, the hiss of alien weapons charging, and the urgent beeping of the explosive devices Lyra had set. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. They had to make it out, no matter what. The squad fought through the Zorath, their movements fluid, instinctive. Every step felt like it could be their last, but Jake was driven by the knowledge that failure wasn't an option. The weapon had been destroyed. The Zorath would never recover from this blow. Finally, they reached the outer doors. As they burst into the open air, the shockwave from the explosion detonated behind them, sending a pulse of energy through the ground. The Zorath base erupted in a massive explosion, a blinding light that consumed everything in its path. The force of the blast knocked them off their feet, but they didn't stop. They kept running. The squad reached the extraction point just as the remaining Zorath forces closed in. Their ships hovered above them, dark and menacing. The battle was far from over, but Jake could feel something inside him shift. They had done it. They had struck a devastating blow to the Zorath's war machine. Alara's voice crackled in his ear. "We've got your back, Jake. You're not alone in this fight." Jake looked around at his team. They were battered, bruised, and exhausted, but they were alive, and they had won. They had shown the Zorath that Earth would not fall without a fight. And with that, they disappeared into the horizon, ready to face whatever came next.